Hello, and welcome to this comprehensive journey into the world of professional cybersecurity. This introductory chapter establishes the foundational pillars of our field, preparing you to master both technical defense and regulatory compliance. This content is for informational and educational purposes only and does not constitute professional legal or compliance advice. While this course discusses regulatory frameworks, always consult with qualified legal counsel or certified compliance professionals before implementing policies or making decisions that affect your organization's legal standing. If you're looking to elevate your career and gain a competitive edge in today's digital marketplace, this course is your gateway to expertise. We will navigate the complexities of network defense, threat identification, and organizational risk management with precision and clarity. By the time you complete this program, you'll possess the specialized knowledge required to protect enterprise infrastructure against sophisticated adversaries. Join us to transform your understanding of security from a basic necessity into a strategic professional advantage. Distinguishing between information security and cybersecurity is essential for any practitioner. While information security is the broad discipline of protecting data in any form, including physical records and intellectual property, cybersecurity specifically focuses on protecting systems, networks, and data in the digital realm. Think of information security as the overarching strategy, whereas cybersecurity is the execution of protection against electronic threats. Mastering this distinction ensures that you approach organizational security with the appropriate scope and focus. At the core of all security efforts lies the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality ensures that sensitive information is accessible only by authorized entities, typically achieved through robust encryption and finely grained access control mechanisms. Integrity confirms that data remains accurate and unaltered during transit or storage, which we verify using cryptographic hashing and digital signatures. Finally, availability guarantees that systems and services remain operational and accessible when needed, often maintained through redundancy, load balancing, and diligent uptime monitoring. Managing security requires a firm grasp of fundamental terminology, such as assets, vulnerabilities, threats, risks, and exploits. An asset is anything of value to the organization, while vulnerability is an inherent weakness in a system that could potentially be leveraged. A threat is a potential occurrence, malicious or accidental, that might compromise an asset, resulting in a risk, the mathematical probability of a loss occurring. An exploit is the specific method or tool used to take advantage of a vulnerability, translating a theoretical risk into a tangible security incident. Modern enterprises must operate under the weight of strict regulatory frameworks and compliance standards. Frameworks like GDPR in Europe, HIPAA for healthcare, and PCI-DSS for payment card industries dictate how organizations must collect, store, and process sensitive data. As a security professional, your role is to translate these legal mandates into technical configurations and administrative policies that move the organization into alignment. This necessitates an ability to communicate security risks in terms that stakeholders and executive leadership can understand and prioritize. Risk management is the systematic process of identifying, evaluating, and addressing potential threats to your digital environment. You have four primary strategies at your disposal: transfer, avoid, mitigate, or accept. You transfer risk to third parties through insurance or managed services, while you avoid it by disabling high-risk features or discontinuing vulnerable processes. Mitigation involves implementing controls to lower exposure, and accepting risk is a conscious decision to absorb the potential impact when the cost of prevention outweighs the cost of the loss. A robust security posture relies on defense in depth, a layered approach that prevents a single point of failure from compromising the entire enterprise. If an attacker manages to bypass the perimeter firewall, they should encounter further restrictions like segment-level access controls, host-based intrusion prevention, and encrypted internal traffic. By stacking heterogeneous security controls, you ensure that even if one component is subverted, the remaining layers continue to protect the underlying assets. This layered philosophy reflects the reality that no system is ever completely impenetrable. Beyond tools and protocols, the discipline of a security analyst is defined by a specific mindset centered on ethical behavior and continuous learning. Because the threat landscape evolves daily, your knowledge from today may become obsolete without consistent effort to keep pace with new attack vectors and research. Adhering to an ethical code of conduct is paramount, as you are frequently entrusted with the most sensitive aspects of an organization's infrastructure. Staying curious, skeptical, and diligent ensures that you provide value well beyond the implementation of software. I look forward to discussing our first module in our next session. Welcome back to our discussion on network architecture, where we will examine the OSI model and the imperative shift towards secure communication protocols. This chapter is designed to provide you with the foundational understanding of how data traverses layers of abstraction and how we must secure each point of transition. The Open Systems Interconnection Model provides a theoretical framework for understanding network function, divided into 7 distinct layers from the physical medium up to the application interface. When we consider network defense, we must view these layers as potential areas for exploitation, as each layer relies on specific headers for routing, addressing, or session management. At the physical layer, we deal with electrical impulses or signals, whereas the data link layer manages framing and hardware addressing, which can be vulnerable to ARP poisoning if not properly segmented. The network layer introduces logical addressing and routing, where IP spoofing remains a classic threat, while the transport layer manages end-to-end communication, often the target of SYN floods or port exhaustion attacks. By understanding the encapsulation process, where each layer adds its own header to the data packet, we can identify exactly where security violation takes place. De-encapsulation, the reverse process, is where a receiving system strips away those headers, and it is precisely during this unwrapping that we must inspect for anomalies or malformed payloads. If we treat the packet as a strictly structured data format, any deviation from the protocol specification becomes an immediate indicator of a potential security breach. Transitioning from legacy protocols to their secure counterparts is not merely a best practice, but a fundamental requirement for any professional network defense strategy. For instance, Telnet transmits data in clear text, meaning any observer on the local network can capture credentials or commands with simple sniffing tools, whereas SSH provides an encrypted tunnel that ensures both confidentiality and integrity for remote shell access. Similarly, the transition from FTP to SFTP addresses the lack of encryption in file transfers, preventing man-in-the-middle attacks that could compromise sensitive data in transit. You will frequently encounter HTTP in legacy systems, but it lacks the transport layer security provided by HTTPS, which utilizes TLS to authenticate the server and encrypt the communication stream. DNSSEC represents another critical evolution, as it adds a layer of cryptographic validation to the domain name system to prevent cache poisoning, which attackers otherwise use to redirect users to malicious infrastructure. These secure alternatives are not optional. They're the baseline mechanism required to maintain the confidentiality and authenticity of network traffic in an inherently untrusted environment. Beyond common protocol upgrades, we must scrutinize the diagnostic traffic that traverses our networks, specifically regarding the Internet Control Message Protocol. While ICMP is essential for network diagnostics, such as reachability testing via ping or path analysis via traceroute, it is frequently exploited as a vector for reconnaissance. Attackers often leverage ICMP messages to map network topologies, discover live hosts, or even exfiltrate data hidden within the payload of large ICMP packets. Consequently, a defensive posture requires granular control over ICMP messages through firewalls or access control lists, allowing only the subtypes necessary for diagnostics while dropping others. Examining packet headers for anomalies, such as unusual TCP flags, mismatched sequence numbers, or illegal IP options, is an advanced skill that distinguishes a reactive administrator from one who proactively defends the perimeter. We must constantly analyze the structure of our traffic to ensure that it adheres to established protocols, as anything else likely signifies either a misconfiguration or an attempt at unauthorized intrusion. Mastering these interactions between layers and understanding the necessity of encrypted transport will serve as the core of your networking expertise as we move forward. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this chapter, we will explore the critical strategies for securing routers, switches, and access points to ensure a robust defense against localized and remote network threats. Hardening network infrastructure begins with the principle of least privilege applied to hardware management interfaces. Every physical router, switch, and access point serves as a potential entry point if its configuration remains in a default state. You must start by disabling all unused physical ports and logical services that are not strictly necessary for the network's operation. Many devices come pre-configured with legacy protocols like Telnet, HTTP, or outdated versions of SNMP, all of which transmit data in plain text. By stripping away these unnecessary services, you reduce the attack surface significantly, leaving attackers with fewer vectors to exploit. It is a systematic process of simplification that makes the remaining configuration easier to audit and secure. Securing the management plane is equally vital, particularly regarding SNMP configurations, which are often mismanaged in production environments. You should strictly avoid using default community strings like public or private, opting instead for SNMP v3, which provides authentication and encryption. Beyond protocol security, implementing control plane policing, or COP, allows you to protect the CPU of your network devices from excessive traffic. Without COP, an attacker could potentially overwhelm the router's control plane with malicious packets, leading to a denial of service condition for the entire segment. By rate-limiting management traffic, you ensure that the infrastructure remains responsive even under duress. This is a practice of protecting the brain of the network from being distracted or exhausted by noise. At the switch level, port security and MAC filtering serve as fundamental gatekeepers. Port security allows you to limit the number of MAC addresses allowed on a single switch port or restrict access to specific pre-authorized hardware addresses entirely. This prevents common Layer 2 attacks like CM table flooding or unauthorized device attachment, where a malicious actor brings their own laptop into the office. However, you must pair these logic-based controls with physical security measures to be truly effective. If a switch is sitting in an unlocked closet, an attacker could simply bypass these logical controls by disconnecting cables or accessing the console ports directly. Ensuring the hardware components are enclosed and locked, climate-controlled racks, is the final physical barrier that completes the logical security architecture. The lifecycle of your infrastructure depends heavily on how you handle firmware patch management and boot integrity. Vulnerabilities often reside in the operating systems of networking gear, which are frequently targeted by automated exploits once a patch becomes public. You need a regular, verified process for testing and deploying updates that does not compromise uptime, combined with secure boot configurations. Secure boot ensures that the device only loads software that has been digitally signed by the manufacturer, preventing persistent rootkits from embedding themselves into the hardware. By integrating these practices into your standard operations, you transform your network hardware from a brittle, vulnerable liability into a hardened, resilient foundation for the rest of your security stack. I will leave you to review these hardening concepts before we move forward. Welcome back. as we turn our attention toward the defensive perimeters of our network infrastructure. We will examine how firewalls and intrusion prevention systems operate to secure traffic flows. To understand network security, we must first distinguish between stateless and stateful inspection firewalls, as they enforce traffic control in fundamentally different ways. A stateless firewall examines individual packets in isolation, typically filtering based strictly on source and destination IP addresses, port numbers, or protocol types defined in the header. Because it does not maintain a record of established connections, it lacks context, which makes it performant but also vulnerable to sophisticated spoofing attacks that mimic legitimate return traffic. In contrast, a stateful inspection firewall tracks the state of active connections by recording information in a state table, such as TCP sequence numbers or connection flags. By validating that incoming packets are part of an ongoing, authorized exchange, the firewall ensures that malicious actors cannot easily bypass rules by simply crafting unauthorized, unsolicited responses. This architectural choice necessitates more memory and processing power, yet provides a significantly higher layer of security for modern enterprise environments where session persistence is essential. As threats evolve, the industry has transitioned toward next-generation firewalls that go beyond simple header filtering to incorporate deep packet inspection and granular application awareness. Unlike legacy systems that might only see traffic on port 80 and assume it is benign web traffic, an NGFW inspects the actual payload of the packet to identify the specific application protocol being used. This deep packet inspection capability allows administrators to enforce policies based on actual application behavior rather than just the port number, which is crucial because many modern applications use non-standard or dynamic ports. If a user tries to tunnel unauthorized traffic through a common port, the NGFW identifies the anomaly, preventing services like peer-to-peer file sharing or unauthorized remote access from masquerading as standard HTTPS traffic. This shift requires administrators to think in terms of identity and application logic rather than just static network parameters. By integrating these contextual insights, security teams can construct a defense that is both more resilient and easier to manage in complex, cloud hybrid network topologies. The actual enforcement of these security policies relies heavily on the careful configuration of access control lists, which serve as the foundational rule set for packet filtering on routers and firewalls. An ACL is essentially an ordered list of permit or deny statements that are processed sequentially, meaning the placement of specific rules often dictates the overall security posture of the device. A best practice is to place the most frequently matched rules at the top of the list to improve performance and minimize latency, while always concluding with an implicit deny all statement to ensure that any traffic not explicitly authorized is dropped. When managing these lists, it is vital to avoid overly permissive rules, such as broad ranges of source or destination IPs, which create unnecessary attack surfaces within your internal network. Consistent periodic auditing of these rules is mandatory, as legacy entries often persist long after a legitimate business requirement has expired, creating shadow rules that could potentially be exploited by an attacker for lateral movement. Beyond mere traffic filtration, modern architectures employ intrusion detection systems and intrusion prevention systems to monitor for malicious activities that might slip past firewall rule sets. An IDS operates in a passive mode, analyzing traffic patterns and alerting administrators to suspicious events without actively blocking them, which is useful for gathering intelligence without interrupting potential business workflows. An IPS, however, is positioned in line with the traffic flow, granting it the capability to drop packets or terminate connections automatically when a threat is identified. These systems primarily utilize two detection methods: signature-based detection, which compares traffic to a database of known malware and exploit patterns, and anomaly-based detection, which builds a baseline of normal behavior and triggers alerts when traffic deviates from that norm. While signature-based systems are highly effective against known exploits, they are inherently blind to zero-day vulnerabilities, making anomaly-based detection an essential complementary layer for identifying unforeseen behavioral disturbances in your network. Effective security is found in the maintenance of these systems, specifically through strict rule-set optimization and routine environmental auditing. You should treat your firewall and IPS configurations as managed code, requiring formal change control processes and version tracking to prevent unauthorized or unintended modifications. During these audits, you must actively identify and remove unused or redundant rules, as rule bloat leads to performance degradation and increases the likelihood of human error during troubleshooting. Always favor the principle of least privilege, ensuring that every service, application, or segment is granted only the absolute minimum amount of connectivity required for its function. When you maintain a clean, well-documented rule set, your infrastructure remains predictable, easier to diagnose during incidents, and significantly more difficult for an adversary to navigate clandestinely. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Today, we turn our attention to virtual private networks and the cryptographic mechanisms that underpin them. In this chapter, we will explore the mechanisms that enable secure communication across untrusted mediums, starting with the implementation of site-to-site and remote access VPNs. We will dissect the IPsec protocol suite, examine the critical differences between tunnel and transport modes, and contrast traditional IPsec solutions with SSL/TLS-based VPNs. Furthermore, we will delve into the underlying mathematics of key exchange and the robust encryption standards that safeguard our packets. By the end of this module, you will understand how to manage the lifecycle of a public key infrastructure to maintain organizational trust. To understand the mechanics of secure transit, we must first distinguish between the two primary ways we deploy VPNs. A site-to-site VPN acts as a transparent bridge between two fixed gateways, typically connecting branch offices to a corporate headquarters over an encrypted tunnel. In contrast, remote access VPNs cater to the individual user, allowing a mobile client to authenticate and establish a secure session with a central gateway from any location. These implementations rely heavily on the IPsec protocol suite, which operates at the network layer of the OSI model to provide confidentiality, integrity, and origin authentication. Within IPsec, we find two fundamental headers that serve distinct purposes in a security posture. The authentication header, or AH, provides integrity and authentication for the entire packet, but notably fails to encrypt the payload, leaving data exposed to anyone capable of sniffing the traffic. Conversely, the encapsulating security payload, or ESP, provides both encryption and authentication, making it the industry standard for securing sensitive data in transit. When configuring ESP, you must define the operational mode, which determines how the IPsec headers are encapsulated relative to the original IP packet. Transport mode is designed for direct end-to-end communication, where the original IP header remains intact and only the payload is encrypted. This is efficient for host-to-host scenarios, but reveals the internal source and destination IP addresses to the public network, which is often undesirable for security auditing. Tunnel mode, by contrast, encapsulates the entire original IP packet within a new IP packet, effectively hiding the internal network topology from the transit medium. This is the mandatory requirement for site-to-site VPN configurations because it allows two routers to act as proxies for their respective internal subnets. While IPsec is foundational, modern development often favors SSL/TLS VPNs for remote access because they bypass the firewall traversal issues that frequently plague IPsec implementations. By utilizing standard HTTPS ports, SSL/TLS VPNs provide granular, application-level access control that is easier to manage in heterogeneous environments. The efficacy of any VPN architecture relies upon the strength of its underlying cryptographic primitives and the security of the initial handshake. Key exchange mechanisms, specifically Diffie-Hellman, allow two parties to securely arrive at a shared secret over an insecure channel by leveraging the mathematical difficulty of the discrete logarithm problem. Once this secret is established, symmetric encryption algorithms like AES or the more performance-oriented ChaCha 20 take over to handle bulk data transmission. While AES remains the backbone of secure infrastructure due to its widespread hardware acceleration, ChaCha 20 offers excellent advantages in efficiency for mobile and resource-constrained devices. Simultaneously, asymmetric algorithms such as RSA or more modern substitutes like elliptic curve cryptography are used to verify identities and bootstrap the session. This intricate dance of algorithms requires a well-maintained public key infrastructure to manage identity and trust. Every certificate issued within your PKI has a defined lifecycle, from the initial certificate signing request to the inevitable moment of expiration or revocation. Managing a PKI is arguably more complex than configuring the VPN tunnels themselves because it involves disciplined administrative rigor. You must account for how certificates are distributed, monitored for upcoming expiration, and effectively revoked using certificate revocation lists or the online certificate status protocol. A compromised private key renders the entire encryption layer moot, meaning that the strength of your VPN is only as robust as your ability to protect the certificates that authorize the connection. When designing these systems, consider how your automation tools handle certificate renewal, as manual management at scale almost always leads to service outages or security gaps. Always remember that encryption is a tool for confidentiality, but the management of the keys is a discipline of identity and access governance. By focusing on the maturity of your key lifecycle processes, you ensure that the cryptographic tunnel remains a closed loop rather than an open door. I look forward to our next session. Welcome back. In this chapter, we will dismantle the traditional concept of network perimeters to embrace the rigorous demands of zero-trust architecture. The shift from perimeter-based security to zero-trust architecture represents a fundamental change in how we perceive the network boundary. For decades, organizations relied on a castle-in-moat strategy where internal traffic was implicitly trusted once it crossed the firewall. This model has become dangerously ineffective in an era of remote work and cloud-native services where the network edge is effectively everywhere. Zero Trust operates on the simple but profound premise of never trust, always verify, regardless of where the request originates. This means that even if a user is physically inside the corporate office on a managed device, they are not granted automatic access to internal assets. Every request must be authenticated, authorized, and encrypted before a connection is established, effectively neutralizing the safety of being inside the network. By abandoning the idea of a trusted zone, we stop assuming that internal traffic is benign and start treating every packet as a potential threat. Microsegmentation is arguably the most practical application of this philosophy, acting as a tactical response to the threat of lateral movement. In a flat network architecture, once an attacker gains access to one endpoint, they can often scan and attempt to compromise almost any other resource. Microsegmentation breaks this flat structure into smaller, secure zones that isolate workloads from one another, even within the same subnet. By enforcing granular firewall policies around individual workloads or containers, we contain the blast radius of any successful exploit. Even if a specific database server is compromised, the attacker remains unable to pivot to the internal mail server or administrative interfaces because no direct path exists. This approach requires a deep understanding of application dependencies, as you must explicitly define which specific services need to talk to each other to function correctly. Anything not explicitly permitted is dropped by default, creating a significantly harder environment for an adversary to navigate. As the network perimeter dissolves, identity has effectively become the new perimeter for modern digital assets. Since we can no longer rely on IP addresses or physical locations to determine if a user or device is legitimate, we must verify the user's credentials and intent at every step. This requires a robust identity provider that can handle multi-factor authentication seamlessly while maintaining a high bar for security across different platforms. When identity is the perimeter, the focus moves away from locking down network ports and toward managing who has access to which resource and under what conditions. This is where the concepts of policy decision points and policy enforcement points become vital to our design. A policy decision point acts as the central authority that evaluates requests against predefined security logic and organizational intent. Once the decision is made, a policy enforcement point sits in the path between the user and the protected resource to execute that decision by granting or denying access. Software-defined perimeter, or SDP, is a sophisticated approach to implementing these concepts by creating a virtualized, dark network environment. Traditional network infrastructure is often discoverable, with internal services broadcasting their presence through DNS or other discovery protocols. An SDP implementation hides infrastructure behind a secure gateway, making it completely invisible to anyone without valid cryptographically signed credentials. The user must first authenticate with an identity verification controller before the gateway even acknowledges the existence of the protected backend hidden behind the perimeter. This creates a powerful mechanism for preventing reconnaissance attacks, as an attacker cannot exploit what they cannot see. Integrating SDP into your environment ensures that even if an attacker manages to port scan your public infrastructure, they find nothing but unresponsiveness. It is a fundamental shift toward making internal resources private by default, rather than relying on obfuscation or simple access lists. Continuous monitoring and validation of user intent form the heartbeat of a mature zero-trust deployment. We cannot assume that because a user was authorized at the start of session, they remain authorized throughout its entire duration. A user's intent might manifest through anomalous file access patterns or connection attempts from a geographically impossible location after a successful login. By consuming telemetry from endpoint detection systems and network sensors, the system can continuously reevaluate the risk score associated with a session. If a user's behavior deviates from known baselines, the policy decision point can automatically revoke access or trigger a step-up authentication challenge. This creates a dynamic, responsive security environment that adapts to real-time risk rather than relying on a static, once-and-done validation at the start of the day. Achieving this requires substantial integration between your identity stack, security analytics, and the infrastructure components that host your applications and data. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to this chapter on wireless and mobile security, where we will examine the hardening of decentralized network edges. We will focus on encryption standards, mobile management infrastructure, and the mitigation of risks inherent to untethered connectivity. Wireless security has undergone significant evolution, moving from the demonstrably broken wired equivalent privacy protocol to the robust WPA3 standard. WEP relied on the RC4 stream cipher with a static key, making it trivial for an attacker to recover the key through statistical analysis of capture packets. WPA followed as a stopgap measure, introducing the temporal key integrity protocol to dynamically change keys, but it still suffered from vulnerabilities. WPA2 brought the advanced encryption standard into play alongside counter mode, cipher blockchaining message authentication code protocol, providing a much higher security floor for residential and enterprise environments. Today, WPA3 addresses remaining weaknesses, such as short password susceptibility, by replacing the pre-shared key exchange with simultaneous authentication of equals. This specific handshake prevents offline dictionary attacks, essentially neutralizing the threat of brute-forcing keys from capture handshake traffic. Understanding these shifts is necessary, because your infrastructure is only as secure as the weakest link in your legacy device support chain. Enterprise-grade deployments move beyond simple passwords by leveraging 802.1x and the extensible authentication protocol to integrate wireless access with backend directory services. When a client attempts to connect, the access point acts as an authenticator, relaying the traffic to a radius server that validates credentials against a central database. This implementation allows network administrators to assign unique, per-user encryption keys and enforce granular access policies that differ from what a simple PSK model could provide. While an SSID broadcast is often necessary for usability, the inherent risk of broadcasting is that it provides a roadmap for attackers to identify the network type and potential entry points. Therefore, disabling SSID broadcasting provides only security through obscurity and should never be viewed as a standalone defense mechanism. Instead, prioritize rogue access point detection by using wireless intrusion prevention systems that scan for unauthorized devices attempting to bridge your internal network to unsecured external transmitters. The proliferation of mobile devices in the workspace necessitates the use of mobile device management solutions to maintain control over corporate data. MDM allows for the remote configuration of device settings, the enforcement of password policies, and the ability to selectively wipe corporate data if a device is lost or reported as compromised. In a bring-your-own-device model, the challenge shifts toward segregating personal applications and data from the work-managed environment to protect privacy while maintaining security posture. Policy enforcement in this context requires clear documentation that outlines the user's responsibilities, such as required operating system updates and the prohibition of rooting or jailbreaking devices. If a managed device does not meet the specified security baseline, the MDM agent should automatically revoke its access to corporate resources like email or specialized internal applications. This automated lifecycle management is the only scalable way to handle a diverse ecosystem of personally owned hardware. Beyond traditional Wi-Fi, we must consider the security implications of Bluetooth and the integration of Internet of Things hardware into our network architecture. Bluetooth remains a frequent target for proximity-based attacks, often utilizing exploits that target implementation flaws in the protocol stack of various mobile and peripheral devices. Mitigation begins with enforcing strict discovery settings, disabling pairing modes when not in use, and ensuring that only encrypted, authenticated connections are permitted between trusted endpoints. IoT devices represent a distinct category of concern because they are frequently manufactured without built-in security features or support for patch management. To mitigate this risk, you should place IoT devices on segmented virtual local area networks that are strictly firewalled from the business network core. By treating these devices as untrusted entities capable of acting as a beachhead, you prevent the lateral movement that often occurs when a hacked smart thermostat or camera is used to scan internal network assets. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back to our discussion on identifying threats, where we will now dive into the technical nuances of malware and the life cycle of ransomware. Today, we will examine how malicious code shifts from simple replication to sophisticated extortion tactics. To understand the modern threat landscape, we must first classify the various types of malicious code that circulate within our networks. A virus requires human intervention to propagate, typically by attaching itself to a legitimate executable file that the unsuspecting user then runs. Worms, in contrast, are autonomous agents that exploit vulnerabilities to traverse networks independently, often exhausting system resources in the process. Trojans masquerade as beneficial software, enticing the user to install them only to open a clandestine backdoor for an attacker. Rootkits operate at a deeper level by modifying the operating system kernel to maintain persistence and hide the presence of other malicious processes. Finally, spyware quietly records user keystrokes, browser activity, and credentials, exfiltrating this data to command and control servers without ever alerting the victim to its presence. Ransomware has evolved from simple screen lockers into a highly structured business model characterized by a clear, multi-stage lifecycle. The delivery phase typically relies on phishing emails or exploit kits that find a single weak entry point into the environment. Once executed, the malware establishes persistence before reaching out to its command and control server to exchange encryption keys. During the encryption phase, the software methodically locks user files using robust, often asymmetric, encryption algorithms that make retrieval impossible without the specific private key held by the attacker. The final extortion phase adds psychological pressure, often threatening to publish stolen sensitive data unless the victim pays a ransom in cryptocurrency, effectively turning the attack into a double extortion scheme. Defenders must also be vigilant against fileless malware, which challenges traditional disk-based scanning tools by living entirely in memory or utilizing legitimate system administration utilities. By leveraging PowerShell scripts or Windows Management Instrumentation (WMI), an attacker can execute malicious commands in the context of trusted system processes. Because these scripts leave no conventional footprint on the hard drive, static signature-based detection becomes largely ineffective for identifying the threat. Instead, security teams must focus on monitoring command line arguments and suspicious process lineage patterns that deviate from standard administrative behavior. This behavioral analysis is essential, as it shifts the focus from what the file is to what the process is actually attempting to do within the operating system. To identify these dynamic threats, organizations often rely on sandboxing, which involves executing suspicious files in an isolated, virtualized environment. This approach allows security analysts to observe the malware's behavior, such as attempts to contact specific IP addresses, modification of registry keys, or massive file system encrypting activity, without risking the actual production infrastructure. When analyzing command and control communication, we look for patterns such as beaconing, where the infected host sends periodic heartbeats to an external server. By capturing and decoding these network packets, incident responders can identify the infrastructure utilized by the attackers and potentially sinkhole their traffic. Effective mitigation strategy requires more than just detection. It mandates immutable, segmented, and verified offline backups that cannot be reached or encrypted by the ransomware in the event of a breach. See you in our next session. Welcome to this module on the human element, where we address the most deceptive and frequently exploited vulnerability in modern networks. We will examine how psychological manipulation serves as the primary gateway for unauthorized access. Social engineering relies on the predictable nature of human behavior rather than technical flaws in software or hardware. An attacker does not always need to break a cryptographic algorithm if they can simply convince a user to hand over their credentials. This process begins with gathering information to build a pretext, which is a fabricated scenario used to gain a victim's trust. For instance, an attacker might pose as an IT support technician or a vendor to bypass natural skepticism. Once rapport is established, the attacker uses this psychological leverage to guide the user into performing actions that compromise security. Understanding that empathy, curiosity, and authority are the primary triggers allows us to build better defenses against these manipulations. Phishing remains the most prevalent digital medium for these attacks, scaling from broad campaigns to highly targeted operations. While standard phishing casts a wide net, spear phishing focuses on specific individuals or organizations by personalizing the communication. Whaling takes this a step further by targeting high-profile executives who possess access to sensitive financial or proprietary data. We also see vishing or voice phishing, where attackers use telephony to manipulate victims through urgency or artificial pressure. These techniques often lead to business email compromise, where a compromised account is used to initiate fraudulent wire transfers or internal data exfiltration. The effectiveness of these tactics highlights why simple security controls are often insufficient against a determined human manipulator. Physical social engineering is equally dangerous because it bypasses digital perimeters entirely by exploiting human courtesy. Tailgating occurs when an unauthorized person follows an employee through a secure door, relying on the social tendency to hold doors open for others. Shoulder surfing is perhaps the most rudimentary yet effective form of information gathering, involving the simple observation of sensitive data entry in public or open spaces. Dumpster diving involves the recovery of sensitive documents that were discarded without proper shredding, providing an attacker with organizational charts or internal memos. These methods require almost no technical expertise, but remain highly effective for gathering the intelligence needed for a larger, more technical attack. Securing a perimeter is futile if the physical entry points are left open to such pedestrian methods. Developing a robust security awareness training program requires shifting from periodic compliance checkboxes to a culture of constant verification. Effective training should simulate real-world threats, such as controlled phishing exercises, to provide employees with practical experience in identifying indicators of malice. When employees understand the mechanisms behind pretexts, they are more likely to pause when faced with unexpected requests for information. However, policy and training are only one side of the coin, as we must assume that human error will eventually occur. Therefore, implementing multi-factor authentication is a non-negotiable step to neutralize the impact of credential harvesting. Even if an attacker successfully tricks a user into providing a password, the requirement for a secondary factor acts as a critical circuit breaker for the attack. I will see you in the next lesson. Welcome back. Let's explore the landscape of web application security and how we maintain integrity in an internet-facing environment. In this chapter, we will master the OWASP Top 10 framework and learn to defend against injection, scripting, and authorization flaws effectively. Web applications are the primary interface for most modern business services, which unfortunately makes them the most frequent targets for external intruders. We begin by analyzing the OWASP Top 10 list, a benchmark document that categorizes the most critical security risks facing web applications today. This list provides a structured way to understand how attackers exploit common weaknesses in code and configuration to gain unauthorized access or exfiltrate sensitive data. Rather than viewing these as random bugs, we approach them as systemic failures that require both developer diligence and structural defense in-depth measures. When you master these categories, you transition from someone who merely patches holes to someone who proactively designs resilient, hardened web services that stand up to modern exploitation attempts. Injection attacks remain a persistent class of vulnerability where untrusted data is sent to an interpreter as part of a command or query. In the context of SQL injection, an attacker manipulates database queries by supplying specifically crafted input that alters the logic of the original statement. This can lead to unauthorized data disclosure, data modification, or even full administrative control over the underlying database server. Similarly, NoSQL injection targets databases like MongoDB, where non-relational query structures can be manipulated if user input is not properly sanitized. Command injection takes this a step further by executing arbitrary operating system commands directly on the server, often leading to full system compromise. If you allow unsanitized input to reach a system shell or a database interpreter, you are essentially providing the keys to the kingdom to any user willing to experiment with your inputs. Cross-site scripting, commonly known as XSS, occurs when an application includes untrusted data in a web page without proper validation or encoding. This allows an attacker to execute malicious scripts in the victim's browser, which can lead to session hijacking, defacement, or the redirection of users to malicious sites. While XSS exploits the trust a user has for a particular site, cross-site request forgery, or CSRF, exploits the trust a site has for the user's browser. In a CSRF attack, an authenticated user is tricked into submitting a malicious request to a web application, performing actions like changing a password or transferring funds without the user ever realizing it. Protecting against these requires a combination of strict output encoding, content security policies, and the use of anti-CSRF tokens to ensure that every request is intentional and authorized. Broken access control and insecure direct object references, frequently referred to as IDOR, represent critical failures in authorization logic. When an application fails to properly enforce restrictions on what authenticated users are allowed to do, they may be able to access unauthorized functionality or data. IDOR occurs specifically when an implementation exposes a reference to an internal object, such as a database key or a file name, without checking for proper permissions. For instance, if a user can change a request parameter from an ID of 101 to 102 and view another user's private profile, the system has fundamentally failed in its authorization duty. We must ensure that every request is checked against a server-side authorization policy that defines what the user is allowed to perform, rather than relying on the client to provide valid identifiers. Securing web applications requires a philosophical shift towards secure coding practices and rigorous input validation at the earliest stages of the development lifecycle. Input validation should occur on a whitelist basis, where you only accept data that matches a known good pattern rather than trying to filter out known bad strings. Furthermore, the deployment of a web application firewall, or WAF, provides a necessary layer of defense that can block malicious traffic patterns before they even reach your application code. A WAF acts as an intelligent proxy, inspecting incoming HTTP and HTTPS traffic for common attack signatures and anomalies. While a WAF cannot fix flawed internal code, it provides a vital buffer that mitigates automated threats and provides visibility into the types of probes your infrastructure is facing on a daily basis. Modern web ecosystems rely heavily on APIs to facilitate communication between services, making REST and SOAP endpoints primary targets for automated discovery and exploitation. Protecting these endpoints requires the same rigor as traditional web pages, plus additional attention to authentication mechanisms like OAuth or JWT to verify both the caller and the scope of the request. You must ensure that rate limiting is effectively implemented to prevent automated scanning tools from harvesting data or launching brute force attacks against your endpoints. Every request to an API must be treated as hostile until proven otherwise, which means enforcing TLS for all communication and removing unnecessary diagnostic information that could leak sensitive architecture details. By treating API security as a first-class citizen of your network defense strategy, you eliminate the risk of leaving secondary entry points open for potential intruders. I look forward to discussing how these theoretical foundations translate into practical network scanning and reconnaissance defense in our next session. Welcome back. In this chapter, we will explore the methodologies used to gather intelligence on target networks and identify vulnerabilities through structured reconnaissance and scanning techniques. Reconnaissance is the foundational phase of any engagement, representing the process of gathering information before an actual attack occurs. We categorize this activity into passive and active reconnaissance based on the level of interaction the surveyor has with the target infrastructure. Passive reconnaissance involves collecting data without directly connecting to or interacting with the target systems, often relying on publicly available information. This is where open source intelligence, or OSINT, becomes essential, as it allows us to map an organization's digital footprint through search engines, public documentation, and metadata. By inspecting domain registration records, social media profiles, and leaked documents, an attacker compiles a comprehensive map of the infrastructure. This approach is inherently stealthy because it leaves no trace on logs that could alert the target to impending scrutiny. Mastering OSINT tools allows a security professional to understand how a company presents itself to the world and what information is inadvertently exposed. Once we transition into active reconnaissance, the engagement moves from observation to direct interaction with the network. This phase is fundamentally different because it involves sending packets to the target services to elicit a response, which invariably leave a footprint in the logs. Port scanning is the primary method here, where we probe specific ports on a target IP to determine their status, such as open, closed, or filtered. MAP remains the industry standard for this task because it offers fine-grained control over scan timing and packet manipulation. A TCP SYN scan, for instance, sends a SYN packet and awaits a SYN ACK, identifying an open port without completing the full three-way handshake, thereby reducing potential detection. Beyond simple port status, we look for service versions and operating system fingerprints. By analyzing the unique signatures in a service's response to non-standard TCP IP probes, we can infer the underlying OS or the specific software version being used to support the application. Identifying specific services allows us to move into vulnerability scanning, where tools like Nessus or OpenVS automate the process of matching service versions against known vulnerability databases. These scanners operate by sending probes that trigger known weaknesses to confirm whether a patch is missing or a configuration is insecure. While effective, this process is loud and relies on pre-computed vulnerability signatures that may miss custom or zero-day issues. Enumeration is a subsequent, deeper dive into those systems, focusing on extracting more granular data, such as user accounts, file shares, and DNS records. Attackers or auditors query DNS servers to perform zone transfers, which could inadvertently reveal the entire internal topology of an organization. Similarly, enumerating SMB shares or Active Directory objects provides a list of reachable resources that could become entry points for privilege escalation or lateral movement. Defending against this structured reconnaissance requires a robust and layered approach to network visibility and response. Because scanning is often the precursor to a more significant breach, implementing rate limiting on ingress traffic can frustrate scanners that rely on rapid, high-volume probe packets. Blocking known scanner IP ranges or suspicious autonomous system numbers at the firewall level can mitigate automated reconnaissance efforts. However, this is largely reactive, so we must also incorporate proactive detection mechanisms like honeypots. A honeypot is a decoy system configured to look like a production asset, designed to collect data on the activity of anyone who interacts with it. Since legitimate traffic should never touch these resources, any interaction serves as a high-fidelity alert that someone is actively probing the internal perimeter. This allows us to observe the attacker's techniques in a controlled environment while hardening our legitimate assets against the identified methods. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this chapter, we will explore the mechanisms behind denial of service attacks and how to build resilient infrastructures capable of mitigating these threats. To understand the landscape of service availability, we must first distinguish between denial of service and distributed denial of service. While a denial of service attack originates from a single source aiming to overwhelm a target's resources, a distributed denial of service attack leverages a botnet to launch traffic from thousands of compromised endpoints simultaneously. This distributed nature makes blocking malicious traffic significantly harder because the incoming requests often appear to originate from legitimate, geographically dispersed users. When addressing these incidents, the primary goal is to maintain service continuity while separating the good traffic from the bad. Understanding this fundamental difference is the first step in designing an effective defense strategy, as your mitigation techniques must scale to handle the overwhelming volume inherent in distributed attacks. Volumetric attacks represent the most straightforward attempt to exhaust network bandwidth through sheer volume. In a UDP or ICMP flood, the attacker sends an enormous quantity of packets to the target, hoping to fill the available link capacity and prevent legitimate packets from reaching their destination. Conversely, protocol attacks focus on exploiting weaknesses in the communication protocols themselves, rather than just raw bandwidth. A classic example is the SYN flood, where an attacker opens numerous TCP connections but never completes the three-way handshake, eventually exhausting the server's connection table. Because the server spends resources waiting for responses that never arrive, it eventually stops accepting new, legitimate connections. Mitigating these requires a deeper analysis of stateful connections rather than just simple bandwidth management. As we move up the OSI model, we encounter application layer attacks, which are often the most insidious because they mimic legitimate user behavior. An HTTP flood, for instance, sends a massive number of HTTP GET or POST requests to a web server. To an intrusion detection system, these look exactly like normal browser requests, but the aggregate load is designed to crash the application backend or exhaust database connections. Because these attacks require relatively low bandwidth to be effective when targeted at heavy backend processes, they bypass traditional volumetric filters. Protecting against these necessitates advanced traffic analysis that inspects headers, cookies, and user behavior patterns to identify anomalous request rates. When you see a sudden, inexplicable jump in CPU utilization on your database server, you're likely looking at the results of an application layer flood. Reflection and amplification attacks pose a unique challenge, as they turn an attacker's strategy into a leverage point against your infrastructure. By sending small requests with a spoofed source IP address to publicly accessible services like DNS or NTP servers, attackers can trick those services into sending much larger responses to the victim. This is the definition of amplification. The attacker consumes only a small amount of their own bandwidth while the victim is bombarded with a massive stream of traffic from legitimate servers. Because the traffic comes from trusted, well-known infrastructure, blocking it without disrupting regular operations is exceptionally complex. Effective defense here often involves ingress filtering and coordinating with upstream providers to block spoof packets before they reach your network perimeter. To build a robust defense, one must employ a multi-layered approach centered on rate limiting and traffic scrubbing. Rate limiting acts as a throttle, imposing hard caps on the number of requests a single IP address can make within a specific window of time. This helps blunt the impact of many automated attacks, though it can occasionally affect legitimate power users if configured too aggressively. Traffic scrubbing services take this further by diverting your inbound traffic through a global network of powerful servers that filter out malicious packets in real time. Only the cleaned, legitimate traffic is then forwarded to your actual server, effectively absorbing the bulk of the attack load. This separation of duty is essential for maintaining uptime during a persistent, high-intensity campaign. Modern resilience is often achieved through content delivery networks that act as a distributed front door for your services. By caching content at the edge, closer to the user, a CDN naturally absorbs significant amounts of traffic that would otherwise hit your origin servers. If an attacker directs a flood at your site, the CDN's massive, globally distributed edges can often distribute that load so thinly across their infrastructure that your backend remains unaffected. Furthermore, a well-architected infrastructure includes elasticity, allowing your systems to scale horizontally by dynamically provisioning more resources when traffic spikes are detected. This combination of edge caching and elastic scaling ensures that even if you cannot stop the attack completely, you can survive it while your response team investigates the root cause. Developing a formal and executable DDoS response plan is the final barrier against total service failure. This plan should clearly identify the key stakeholders, Define the triggers for activating scrubbing services and document the specific communication channels between your network engineering and security teams. You should regularly test your infrastructure elasticity under simulated stress to identify bottlenecks before a real crisis hits. Without a clear plan that defines who makes the decision to switch traffic to a scrubbing provider, precious minutes are wasted during an active attack. By maintaining thorough documentation and ensuring your team knows how to interact with your cloud-based defenses, you transform your defense from a reactive scramble into a measured operational procedure. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back to our journey through the complex landscape of defensive security. Today we examine the mechanics of advanced persistent threats and how to detect unauthorized movement within a hardened environment. When we discuss advanced persistent threats, or APTs, we are looking at actors who possess the capability and intent to remain undetected within a network for extended periods. Unlike the noisy, automated script kiddies who rely on volume, these threats employ the strategic stages of the cyber kill chain to systematically compromise an organization. The kill chain starts from reconnaissance and moves through weaponization, delivery, and exploitation, eventually landing in the hands of the MITRE ATT and CK framework. Understanding this framework is crucial because it categorizes attacker behavior into observable techniques, giving you a shared language to map against your current security posture. Initial access is the gateway, often occurring through spear phishing, exploitation of public-facing applications, or supply chain compromises. Once an entry vector is secured, the adversary immediately focuses on internal reconnaissance to map out the environment. You must realize that an APT does not view a network as one giant entity, but rather as a series of interconnected nodes waiting to be bridged. By identifying where your perimeter weak points align with these common entry vectors, you can begin to prioritize your detection engineering efforts effectively. Credential dumping represents a critical pivot point in an adversary's lifecycle, often serving as the true catalyst for lateral movement. Tools like Mimikatz have become synonymous with this stage because they exploit the way Windows stores authentication tokens in memory. When a process gains administrative privileges, an attacker can extract plaintext passwords, NTLM hashes, or Kerberos tickets directly from the Local Security Authority Subsystem Service, or SAS. Protecting against this requires more than just perimeter firewalls. It demands hardware-based root of trust, like trusted platform modules and features such as Credential Guard in Windows. Even if you secure the credentials, the attacker will often attempt to move laterally by compromising less secure service accounts. We see this frequently when an actor harvests legacy credentials stored in configuration files or scripts shared across a network drive. From a defensive standpoint, you should treat every endpoint as potentially untrusted once a single credential has been compromised. Implementing strict access controls reduces the blast radius of these dumped credentials, limiting the attacker's ability to transition from a workstation to a domain controller. Lateral movement is the process by which an intruder jumps from a compromised system to another, often deeper, system within your network. Adversaries commonly employ techniques like SSH tunneling or SOX proxies to create persistent, encrypted channels for their internal activities. By tunneling traffic through an established connection, they can bypass traditional network segmentation and hide their communications from standard deep packet inspection. Detecting this requires a shift in focus from static rules to behavioral baselines, such as looking for unusual internal-to-internal traffic patterns. Specifically, you should watch for SMB or RDP connections from machines that typically only act as database clients or non-business hours connections to sensitive file servers. Monitoring for data exfiltration over non-standard ports is equally vital, as attackers often wrap command and control traffic in common protocols to mimic legitimate web browsing. If you see persistent outbound connections to suspicious external IPs, coupled with internal lateral movement headers, you're likely witnessing an active exfiltration attempt. Establishing a robust logging strategy that captures process-level events and internal network session metadata is the only way to make the invisible visible. Once an attacker reaches their objective or finds a point of stability, they focus on post-exploitation cleanup and maintaining long-term persistence. This is the stage where many defenders make the mistake of only looking for active malware, ignoring the quiet indicators left behind in the operating system. Persistent threats often anchor themselves by modifying registry keys to trigger execution on startup or by creating innocuous-looking scheduled tasks. By configuring these tasks to run under the guise of system processes or maintenance scripts, they ensure their presence survives reboots and user logoffs. A thorough investigator will look for modifications to autorun keys, WMI event consumers, and hidden services that lack clear digital signatures. Cleanup is an essential part of the attacker's playbook because it eliminates traces of their tools and logs of their commands, leaving the SOC team chasing ghosts. Your defensive strategy must include baselining known good configurations for these persistence mechanisms, enabling you to alert on any unauthorized alterations. If you can identify the difference between a legitimate system update and a malicious registry manipulation, you have successfully closed a critical gap in your defense. I will see you in our next session. Welcome back to our exploration of security architecture, where we will examine the foundational pillars of access identity management. In this session, we investigate the AAA framework and the mechanisms required to secure digital identities in modern enterprise environments. The cornerstone of any secure system is the AAA framework, which stands for Authentication, Authorization, and Accounting. Authentication is the process of verifying that an entity is who they claim to be, typically through a set of credentials or tokens. Once the identity is established, authorization determines the scope of access that the entity has within the network or application. This involves comparing the authenticated identity against defined access control lists or policies to permit or deny specific actions. Accounting, the final component, is responsible for recording the actions performed by the user, creating a trail for auditing and forensic purposes. Without this trifecta, a system cannot maintain accountability or enforce the principle of least privilege effectively. We see these principles applied in various network protocols, most notably Radius and TCAX+. While both provide centralized authentication, Radius is primarily focused on network access and uses UDP, whereas TCAX+ offers more granular command authorization and relies on the more reliable TCP transport. In current cloud-based and hybrid environments, we often need to manage access across multiple disparate systems without forcing users to re-authenticate constantly. This requirement led to the adoption of single sign-on, or SSO, which relies on federation standards like SAML and OIDC. SAML 2.0 is an XML-based framework that exchanges authentication and authorization data between an identity provider and a service provider. Conversely, OpenID Connect, or ODC, is an identity layer built on top of the OAuth 2.0 protocol, providing a more lightweight, JSON-friendly approach that is particularly well-suited for modern web and mobile applications. By offloading the authentication process to a central, trusted identity provider, organizations reduce the attack surface by centralizing credential management. This shift away from siloed login mechanisms is essential for maintaining a clean security posture. Managing identities in this fashion ensures that when a user leaves an organization, their access is revoked globally rather than needing manual adjustments in dozens of individual databases. When users must authenticate directly to a local registry, the integrity of these credentials relies heavily on robust password policies and secure storage mechanisms. Complexity requirements mandate a mix of character types to increase entropy, while rotation policies aim to mitigate the risk of password reuse and the longevity of compromised credentials. However, Policies are secondary to how the system stores the actual credential data, which should never be held in plain text. We mitigate the risk of rainbow table attacks by utilizing salting, where a unique, random string is added to the password before it is passed through a hashing function. The hashing function must be computationally expensive, like Argon2 or BCRYPT, to slow down brute force attempts from attackers. By combining these cryptographic practices with strict length and complexity requirements, the risk of credential exposure through database exfiltration is significantly reduced. These safeguards act as a final barrier when authentication fails to block a malicious actor through traditional means. Because passwords are inherently vulnerable to theft or social engineering, we must augment the authentication process with multi-factor authentication. MFA requires the user to provide two or more distinct types of evidence to verify their identity. These factors fall into several categories, including something you know, like a secret PIN or password, and something you have, such as a secure hardware token or a mobile device generating a time-based one-time password. We also include something you are, which utilizes biometric data like fingerprints or facial recognition, and something you do, which might involve behavioral analytics like typing patterns or navigation habits. Finally, we must consider location-based context, which factors in where you are by validating an IP address, GPS coordinate, or geofence to determine if the access request originated from a trusted territory. By requiring factors from different categories, we ensure that an attacker would need to compromise multiple independent security domains to gain illicit access. The most secure implementations favor physical hardware tokens over SMS-based codes, as the latter is susceptible to SIM swapping and interception attacks. I look forward to discussing how we structure these permissions logically in the next session. Welcome back to our exploration of modern identity management architectures within the enterprise. In this chapter, we focus on the practical implementation of role-based access control, a cornerstone of sustainable security administration. We will examine how to transition from fragmented discretionary systems toward a structured, role-centric model that aligns directly with your organizational business functions. By the end of this module, you will understand how to design, implement, and maintain an access architecture that minimizes administrative overhead while effectively mitigating the risk of privilege creep. Implementing role-based access control starts with the fundamental task of defining user roles based on actual business functions rather than individual user identities. When we design these roles, we must map them strictly to the minimum permissions required to perform a specific job, a concept often referred to as the principle of least privilege. In a discretionary access control environment, access rights are too often tied to the individual, which causes security to degrade whenever that employee changes roles or departments. By abstracting permissions into roles, we ensure that an auditor can easily verify what a specific function, like a payroll clerk or a network administrator, is permitted to do across the entire system. Role permission mapping acts as the bridge between business requirements and technical policy, and when this is done correctly, it simplifies administration by allowing us to change access for an entire group by simply updating the role definition. The issue of privilege creep is perhaps the most significant security debt that organizations accumulate over time. Privilege creep occurs when users aggregate access rights as they change positions within a company and nobody ever remembers to revoke the older, redundant permissions. Using a role-based structure directly combats this by requiring users to be assigned to specific, well-defined career tracks or job functions, automatically removing access as they transition away from previous roles. Furthermore, hierarchical roles allow us to simplify the management of complex environments by creating nested structures where senior roles inherit all the base permissions of junior roles. This architectural approach avoids the redundancy of having to define the same access level repeatedly for different but related job levels. It organizes access in a way that is logically consistent with the organizational hierarchy, which makes troubleshooting and impact analysis significantly more predictable. Transitioning from discretionary access control to a role-based model requires more than just technical reconfiguration. It requires a disciplined change management process. You cannot simply flip a switch, as the audit process must begin with a comprehensive review of current, often inconsistent, access assignments. Periodically auditing role assignments is not merely a compliance requirement, but a technical necessity to identify deviations or shadow permissions that often bypass the central authorization policy. For scenarios involving temporary role elevations, such as an emergency break glass account or a seasonal project role, we should enforce strict expiration policies to ensure these permissions do not become permanent features of a user profile. In the same vein, cross-departmental access requirements should be handled by creating dedicated guest or project roles rather than granting ad hoc exceptions to individuals who lack the appropriate clearance level. Effective governance in this model relies heavily on maintaining a clear separation between the identification of the user and the authorization of the role. When you treat roles as immutable assets that represent job functions, the resulting security posture becomes far more resistant to unauthorized modifications by insiders. Monitoring these access paths allows security teams to detect anomalies before they evolve into significant security breaches. As you build these definitions, remember that the goal is to make the system behave in a way that respects business reality while enforcing rigid technical boundaries. Every assignment that we make must be accounted for in our periodic reviews to ensure that our initial design remains aligned with the actual needs of the organization as it grows and changes. I will see you in our next technical discussion. Welcome back. In this chapter, we explore how modern systems move beyond static roles to achieve precise, context-aware security through attribute and rule-based access control models. When we discuss access control, we often default to the traditional role-based access control model because it is conceptually simple and easy to map to organizational hierarchies. However, as infrastructure grows in complexity, these static roles often become overly permissive or, conversely, too restrictive to handle unique edge cases. Attribute-based access control, or ABAC, represents a paradigm shift by moving the decision-making logic from a predefined role to a set of dynamic attributes associated with the user, the resource, and the environment. Think of an attribute as a variable in an equation. A user might have a clearance level, a department, and a current device posture, while a resource might have a sensitivity classification or a required compliance standard. When a request is made, the policy engine evaluates these variables in real time, allowing for a level of granularity that rigid roles simply cannot match. This creates a functional bridge between a simple permission request and a decision that understands the nuance of the current state of the network. To make ABAC effective, we must consider the environment, which is often the most overlooked component of the security triad in this model. Environment attributes include factors such as the current location of the user, the time of day, and the security state of the network connection being used to initiate the request. For example, a system might allow an administrator to modify production database records only if they're connecting from a known corporate office IP range during standard business hours. If that same administrator attempts to access the resource from an unrecognized public network at 3 in the morning, the system could deny access, even if their credentials and job role are theoretically valid for that task. This context-aware security ensures that your defense strategy remains resilient against scenarios where an account might be compromised by an attacker operating from an unexpected geography or outside of typical operational patterns. Rule-based access control, or RuBAC, often works in tandem with these attributes to provide the concrete logic needed for enforcement. While ABAC dictates the values of the variables, RubyAC provides the if-then statements or the Boolean logic that dictates whether access is granted or denied based on those values. When implementing this, I find that writing these policies in plain text logic is the most sustainable approach for long-term compliance and auditing. If a policy is codified as a complex, proprietary binary structure, it becomes invisible to auditors and difficult for your team to maintain without introducing bugs. By using human-readable logic, you ensure that the security policy aligns with the business requirements and that any member of the security team can immediately understand why a particular user was granted or denied access at a specific moment in time. In highly regulated industries such as healthcare or finance, these granular controls are not just a convenience, but a fundamental requirement for maintaining security postures. Organizations in these sectors often grapple with complex authorization needs that cannot be satisfied by static groups, as the regulatory environment explicitly dictates that access must be restricted to the minimum necessary level based on data sensitivity. ABAC and RubyAC allow these companies to implement policies that scale as the organization grows without needing to create thousands of unique, brittle roles that eventually become impossible to manage. You effectively move the decision-making intelligence into a centralized policy engine that can evaluate intricate constraints without requiring manual intervention from an IT administrator every time a user's context changes slightly. This automation reduces the administrative burden on your team while simultaneously closing the security gaps that naturally appear when roles are assigned but never revoked or updated. Combining these models into a hybrid access management framework allows you to leverage the strengths of each individual strategy while mitigating their inherent limitations. Many successful practitioners use traditional roles to handle broad, common access tasks, while implementing ABAC for those specific, high-risk assets that require dynamic evaluation. By layering these models, you create a defense-in-depth approach to identity that ensures users only gain access when their verified identity, their project-based requirements, and their current situational context all align perfectly. Implementation requires careful planning, as the complexity of the policy engine grows alongside the number of rules being enforced. But the result is a robust, responsive security architecture. When you treat access control as a dynamic calculation rather than a static list, you drastically reduce the surface area available to an adversary who might otherwise exploit roles that were over-provisioned months or years ago. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this chapter, we will explore the critical domain of privileged access management and governance, focusing on how to secure the most sensitive accounts within your infrastructure. Privileged access management, or PAM, is fundamentally about securing the keys to the kingdom by controlling and monitoring powerful accounts that possess elevated rights. When we talk about these accounts, we are referring to identities that can modify system configurations, manage other user accounts, or gain direct access to sensitive data repositories. Without a structured PAM strategy, these accounts become the primary target for attackers who seek to gain persistent access, perform lateral movement, or exfiltrate intellectual property. By implementing specialized PAM solutions, we shift away from static, long-lived credentials toward dynamic and observable access models. This transition is not merely a technical choice, but a strategic imperative for organizations aiming to harden their security posture effectively. One of the most effective techniques within the PAM ecosystem is just-in-time provisioning, which rejects the traditional model of lingering administrative privileges. Instead of granting a broad set of rights that remain active indefinitely, JIT provisioning grants elevated access only for a specific window of time and for a specific task. This approach significantly reduces the attack surface because an attacker who compromises a standard user session finds no dormant administrative permissions to exploit. Once the required activity is completed or the temporal window expires, the access is automatically revoked or reverted to a low-privilege state. This methodology aligns perfectly with the broader goal of minimizing the duration an organization remains exposed to potential misuse of elevated identities. Central to this management strategy is credential vaulting, which acts as a secure repository for sensitive passwords, keys, and tokens. Rather than having administrators remember or keep shared administrative passwords on local machines, these credentials are stored in a hardened vault. A PAM solution facilitates checkout and check-in procedures, where the user requests access to a credential and the system provides it temporarily, often rotating the password automatically after each use. Beyond just storage, these platforms frequently include session recording capabilities that create a high-fidelity audit trail. By logging every command executed during an elevated session, we ensure that accountability is maintained, turning potential black box administrative actions into a transparent and auditable sequence of events. The principle of least privilege remains the cornerstone upon which all access governance is built, requiring that users receive only the permissions necessary to perform their stated roles. In practice, this means we must rigorously audit the creation of accounts and ensure that no identity is granted broader scope than required by their daily duties. This principle extends to the separation of duties, which is a structural control designed to ensure that no single individual possesses the power to execute a sensitive task from start to finish. By splitting critical administrative operations, such as approving and executing a change in a production database, between two different individuals, we effectively mitigate the risks posed by malicious insiders or compromised administrative accounts. Managing non-human identities, specifically service accounts, presents a unique set of challenges compared to managing individual human users. Service accounts are frequently embedded in scripts, CI/CD pipelines, or runtime environments, leading to hard-coded secrets that are difficult to manage and rotate. Governance requires that these service accounts follow the same rigorous lifecycle management as human accounts, including regular access reviews and, where possible, the replacement of static credentials with dynamic secrets. By moving toward a model where applications request short-lived tokens from an identity management service, we eliminate the risks associated with long-term, unmanaged service account credentials that often go forgotten for years. Finally, sustainable governance relies on regular access reviews and attestation processes to ensure that current permissions continue to align with changing business needs. Over time, users naturally accumulate permissions as they move between teams or take on new responsibilities, a phenomenon often referred to as privilege creep. Periodic attestation requires managers or data owners to formally certify that a specific user still requires their current set of high-level permissions. If a business requirement has shifted, those privileges must be pruned, thereby reinforcing our architectural commitment to ongoing security compliance. This formal process transforms access management from a static one-time setup into a living, breathing cycle of continuous improvement and risk reduction. I look forward to discussing how these identity management principles integrate with directory services in our following session. Welcome back to our exploration of modern identity systems and how they underpin the security posture of both local and distributed networks. This chapter focuses on directory services and cloud identity, specifically how to govern trust in an era where the perimeter is effectively obsolete. Active Directory has served as the backbone of corporate infrastructure for decades, acting as the centralized authority for authentication and authorization through protocols like Kerberos. From a security perspective, understanding the life cycle of a Kerberos ticket is paramount because improper handling of the key distribution center service account can lead to catastrophic compromises. A golden ticket attack, for instance, occurs when an adversary gains access to the KRBit GT account hash, allowing them to forge TGTs that grant persistent, forged credentials for any user in the domain. To defend against this, We must maintain strict control over domain admin memberships and ensure regular rotation of the domain controller's account passwords to invalidate stolen secrets. Furthermore, group policy objects allow us to enforce security configurations across the environment, such as disabling legacy LAN manager authentication or restricting local administrative privileges on workstations. When we move these directory services to the cloud, we shift our focus to Intra ID, formerly known as Azure AD, which utilizes different protocols like SCML, OIDC, and OAuth 2.0 to manage access. This transition requires a fundamental change in how we perceive identity boundaries, moving from a static, location-based trust model toward a contextual, identity-verified approach. In hybrid environments, Identity Federation becomes the bridge that allows users to traverse between on-premises systems and cloud-based software-as-a-service applications using a single set of credentials. This mechanism relies on a trust relationship between an identity provider and a service provider, where the former issues claims that are consumed by the latter to grant access. A common pitfall here is the misconfiguration of token signing certificates or failing to enforce conditional access policies that evaluate the user's risk level before granting a session. For cloud-native workloads, we no longer need to provision static service account credentials, which are often hard-coded and prone to leakage in source code repositories. Instead, we use managed identities, which provide an automatically rotated identity in Intra ID that services can use to authenticate to other cloud resources without the developer ever managing a secret. The system handles the entire lifecycle, ensuring that the identity is bound to the resource itself rather than a human actor. Integrating these various systems requires a standardized approach to lifecycle management, which is where the system for cross-domain identity management enters the picture. SCM automates the provisioning and deprovisioning of user attributes, significantly reducing the window of opportunity for orphaned accounts to be exploited by attackers seeking residual access. Securing the identity store itself requires rigorous attention to replication traffic and the integrity of the directory database. In a traditional Windows environment, unauthorized replication requests can be used by an adversary to perform a DC sync attack, allowing them to pull password hashes for all users directly from a domain controller. We must configure directory-level permissions so that only authorized, hardened service accounts possess the replicating directory changes privilege, and we should monitor logs for unusual replication behavior that deviates from baseline activity. As we move to the cloud, the identity store is managed by the provider, but the responsibility to audit and secure access to that store remains with the organization. This means implementing rigorous multi-factor authentication, enforcing the principle of least privilege for directory roles, and utilizing privileged identity management solutions that require just-in-time elevation. If we treat the identity provider as the ultimate source of truth, we must defend it with the same, if not greater, rigor than our internal network boundaries. The complexity of these systems is significant, but their role in securing the enterprise is absolute. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome to our discussion on biometrics and physical security. We will explore how physical identifiers and access hardware anchor our digital security posture. Biometric systems rely on the unique physiological or behavioral characteristics of an individual to establish identity. Fingerprint scanning functions by mapping minutiae points, such as ridge endings and bifurcations, into a mathematical model. Iris scanners capture the intricate patterns of a human iris using infrared light, which remains relatively stable throughout a person's life. Facial recognition technology has evolved from simple geometric distance measurements to complex deep learning models that identify nodal points on a face. While these methods provide a high degree of convenience, they are never perfectly accurate, necessitating a nuanced understanding of their statistical performance metrics. Implementing these systems requires choosing the right hardware, but even more importantly, configuring the software to balance security requirements with user accessibility. The reliability of any biometric implementation is defined by three critical metrics: the false acceptance rate, the false rejection rate, and the crossover error rate. The false acceptance rate, or FAR, measures the probability that the system incorrectly authenticates an unauthorized user, representing a significant security risk. Conversely, the false rejection rate, or FRAR, tracks the frequency with which an authorized user is denied access, which directly impacts user experience and organizational productivity. These two metrics typically move in opposite directions. Tightening the sensitivity of a scanner to reduce the FAR inevitably increases the frequency of the FRR. The crossover error rate, also known as the equal error rate, is the point where the FAR and FRR are equal, providing a single metric to benchmark the effectiveness of a biometric sensor. System administrators must tune these thresholds based on the sensitivity of the environment, where a highly secure data center might accept a higher FRR to minimize the risk of a false acceptance. Storing biometric data introduces significant privacy and security dilemmas that organizations must address through careful architectural design. Unlike a password, which can be reset when compromised, a biometric template is a permanent marker of an individual's identity, making data breaches carry lifelong consequences. Regulations like GDPR or CCPA impose strict requirements on how such sensitive categorical data is collected, stored, and managed. Best practices dictate that raw images of fingerprints or irises should never be stored. Instead, systems should store salted, hashed representations of the data that cannot be reverse engineered into the original biometric image. Furthermore, separating the biometric database from the primary identity management system adds a layer of defense in depth against lateral movement. Even if an attacker gains access to the authentication server, they should be unable to reconstruct the actual biometric profiles of the users. The final piece of this puzzle is the convergence of physical and logical security measures, which is essential for protecting critical infrastructure. Integrating proximity-based keycards and turnstiles with Active Directory or LDAP services ensures that a person's physical location is synchronized with their digital access rights. If a user is physically present in a secure office, their credentials should not simultaneously be used to access a VPN from a remote location, a concept known as impossible travel. Hardening entry points to server rooms involves not just electronic locks, but also environmental controls and surveillance, such as man-traps that prevent tailgating. By treating physical entry points as network nodes, defenders can gain visibility into who accesses the data center and when. Achieving this unity between physical and digital silos creates a more robust security posture that protects both the hardware and the data residing within it. I will see you in our next technical deep dive. Welcome back. In this chapter, we will explore the intricate landscape of global regulatory frameworks and the essential compliance standards that dictate modern organizational security. Navigating the regulatory landscape can often feel like a bureaucratic exercise, but these frameworks provide the baseline security posture required to operate in global markets. When we look at regulations such as the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, we aren't just talking about privacy. We're talking about a fundamental shift in how organizations categorize, track, and protect personal data by design and default. Similarly, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA, imposes strict controls over electronic protected health information, requiring rigorous access audits and encryption standards that go far beyond standard IT practices. For those dealing with transactions, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, or PCDSS, acts as a prescriptive set of requirements to ensure cardholder data is secure throughout its entire lifecycle. Meanwhile, the Federal Information Security Management Act, or FISMA, forces federal agencies to integrate security into their capital planning and enterprise architecture processes. Failure to comply with these standards does not just result in technical debt. It leads to massive financial penalties, legal exposure, and irreparable reputational damage. Beyond these specific mandates, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, or SOX, plays a critical role in financial integrity by requiring internal control for financial reporting to prevent accounting fraud. Often, professionals become overwhelmed by the sheer number of controls required by these disparate regulations, leading to what we call audit fatigue. This occurs when an organization treats each compliance requirement as an isolated silo, duplicating work and creating massive inefficiencies in documentation. Instead, mature organizations use control mapping to create a unified control framework that satisfies multiple requirements simultaneously. By identifying the overlap between a GDPR control and a related PCI DSS requirement, for instance, you can streamline your evidence collection processes. This strategic approach turns compliance from a static checklist into a continuous, manageable operational objective. Within these frameworks, the role of the data protection officer has become a focal point, especially under regulations like the GDPR. A DPO is responsible for overseeing the strategy for data protection and ensuring that the organization adheres to the relevant laws while acting as a bridge between the technical teams and regulatory authorities. This role is not merely an advisory one. It requires a deep understanding of corporate processes and the ability to challenge technical decisions that might put consumer data at risk. In addition to human oversight, documentation is the backbone of any compliance effort, and you cannot claim to be compliant if you cannot prove it. Evidence collection must be an automated, repeatable process that produces artifacts, such as system screenshots, access logs, or configuration snapshots, that an auditor can verify during a review cycle. This level of rigor ensures that the security controls which exist on paper actually function as intended within the production network. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to this module, where we explore the strategic layer of security by defining the governance frameworks and policies that dictate organizational behavior. We will examine how to translate abstract business objectives into actionable security mandates. Enterprise security is rarely a technical problem. It is fundamentally a governance challenge. Without a structured hierarchy of documentation, your technical controls operate in a vacuum, lacking the mandate required for consistent enforcement. We differentiate documentation by its level of abstraction, starting with policies as the high-level statements of management intent. Standards follow as the mandatory, specific requirements that all systems must meet to remain compliant. Guidelines provide the recommended best practices, offering flexibility where absolute rigidity is not strictly necessary. Finally, technical procedures describe the granular, step-by-step instructions for implementation. By separating these layers, you ensure that your security program can adapt to technological shifts without requiring a rewrite of your core business mandates. Developing a robust acceptable use policy is perhaps the most significant task in establishing an organizational baseline. This document must clearly articulate the boundaries between professional utility and personal use, and it must clearly define the consequences of policy violation. If a policy is too restrictive, employees will bypass it, creating shadow IT. If it is too vague, it becomes legally unenforceable during disciplinary actions. Every incident response policy should similarly follow this principle, detailing the roles, responsibilities, and communication channels necessitated during a breach. You must formalize these procedures before an incident occurs, as the stress of an active exploitation attempt is not the environment to decide who possesses the authority to kill a network connection. Change management policies are the final line of defense against self-inflicted system failures and unauthorized modifications. Every change, whether it is a firewall rule update or a patch deployment, must be documented tested in a non-production environment, and authorized by a designated board or individual. This process ensures that you maintain full accountability for the state of your infrastructure at any given time. If you permit ad hoc changes, you eventually lose track of the attack surface, rendering your earlier defensive efforts largely irrelevant. Integrating change management into the broader IT governance lifecycle ensures that security remains a constant requirement rather than an afterthought applied to a malfunctioning system. Frameworks such as COBIT and ITL provide the structural scaffolding necessary to align cybersecurity efforts with overall business goals. While COBIT directs its attention toward the governance of enterprise IT and the alignment of risks with strategic outcomes, ITL offers an operational framework for service management. These frameworks are not merely administrative paperwork. They provide a common language for security teams to communicate with board-level leadership. When you can present security initiatives in terms of risk reduction, operational cost saving, or regulatory adherence, you change the way leadership perceives your department. Shifting the conversation from technical performance to business value is the hallmark of a mature security posture. Establishing a culture of security throughout the hierarchy requires that these policies become a normalized part of professional life. Leadership must not be exempt from the security mandates they approve, as public noncompliance from management signals that security is an optional activity. Board-level reporting should focus on key performance indicators that matter to the organization, such as time to remediate critical vulnerabilities or the efficacy of current risk insurance. By ensuring that security policies are visible, audited, and strictly adhered to from the top down, you create an environment where security is a default expectation rather than a disruptive interruption. This structural cohesion is what ultimately differentiates a resilient organization from one that is merely hoping for the best. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome to the chapter on risk assessment and mitigation planning. In this section, we will establish the necessary framework to translate technical vulnerabilities into business-focused decisions. Risk management is fundamentally the process of identifying, evaluating, and prioritizing risks to minimize the impact of negative events on an organization. When we talk about qualitative versus quantitative assessment, we are essentially choosing between intuition and hard data. Qualitative assessment uses descriptive scales like high, medium, or low to rank threats based on their likelihood and impact, which is often sufficient for general prioritization. Quantitative assessment takes this further by assigning numerical values to the frequency of occurrence and the potential loss, typically expressed in monetary terms. Organizations often start with a qualitative approach to filter risks before applying a rigorous quantitative analysis to the most critical assets. This dual approach ensures that we remain efficient without sacrificing the accuracy required for high-stakes decision-making. Relying solely on one method often leaves blind spots in either the breadth of concern or the depth of financial justification. To perform a quantitative analysis, we use specific metrics that clarify the financial exposure of an asset. The single loss expectancy, or SLE, represents the potential loss caused by a single realized threat, calculated by multiplying the asset value by the exposure factor. Once we have the SLE, we calculate the annualized loss expectancy, or ALE, by multiplying the SLE by the annualized rate of occurrence. If a server worth $100,000 is compromised, and the expected impact is 50%, your SLE is $50,000. If statistical data suggests this event happens once every 5 years, your annualized rate of occurrence is 0.2. Multiplying 50,000 by 0.2 gives you an ALE of $10,000, which provides a clear budget benchmark for potential security controls. This calculation allows a security professional to argue for an investment, such as a $12,000 firewall that prevents that specific $10,000 annual loss. Threat modeling is our structural approach to identifying threats within a system architecture before those systems enter production. The STRIDE model, an acronym for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege, forces us to consider the perspective of an attacker. Alternatively, the PASTA framework, which stands for Process for Attack Simulation and Threat Analysis, is a more risk-centric approach that aligns security objectives with business requirements. By simulating how an adversary might interact with our system, we identify where our defenses are porous. PASTA is particularly useful because it integrates stakeholders from both technical and business sides, ensuring that the identified threats match the organizational mission. Applying either model transforms security from a reactive activity into a proactive, design-based discipline. Every organization arrives at a different conclusion when defining their risk appetite and tolerance levels, which are the boundaries for acceptable risk exposure. Risk appetite is the total amount of risk an organization is willing to accept in pursuit of its goals, while risk tolerance describes the variance from that appetite that the leadership considers acceptable. These values are not static and should be reviewed periodically during executive planning sessions. Without clearly defined levels, security teams may over-engineer solutions for trivial risks or, conversely, ignore major liabilities. These levels serve as the filter through which all risk register entries must pass. If a risk register records an issue that exceeds the defined risk tolerance, the organization is effectively forced to address it unless leadership explicitly accepts the deviation. A risk register is the primary documentation tool used to track identified risks throughout their life cycle. It should contain a description of the risk, its probability and impact, the assigned owner, and the chosen mitigation strategy. This document must be a living entity, not a static spreadsheet created once and forgotten. Continuous risk monitoring ensures that as the threat landscape shifts or the infrastructure is updated, our assessment remains synchronized with reality. Regular audits of the register help identify risks that have been retired, risks that have intensified, and emerging threats that were not previously factored into the plan. If the risk register does not accurately reflect the current environment, the organization will eventually fail to allocate resources where they are needed most. Business Impact Analysis, or BIA, is the process that allows us to distinguish between assets that are simply important and assets that are mission-critical. During a BIA, we analyze how different disruptive incidents would affect the organization's operations, focusing on the maximum tolerable downtime and recovery objectives. By prioritizing resources in this manner, we ensure that our mitigation efforts protect the functions that keep the business viable during a catastrophe. A business impact analysis provides the rationale for the budget and effort invested in redundancy, backups, and physical security. Without this analysis, one might accidentally prioritize the security of a marketing file server over the core payment processing gateway. This mapping of technical systems to business processes is the hallmark of a mature security posture. Once risks are identified and assessed, we must decide on a risk treatment plan, choosing between mitigation, transfer, avoidance, or acceptance. Mitigating risk involves implementing security controls to reduce the likelihood or impact of a threat, such as installing multi-factor authentication to reduce the likelihood of unauthorized access. Transferring risk is usually done through insurance or outsourcing security responsibilities to a managed service provider that assumes the contractual liability. Avoidance means changing our business practices to eliminate the risk entirely, like decommissioning a legacy system that has no viable patches. Finally, accepting the risk is a valid strategy when the cost of mitigation exceeds the potential loss, provided that this decision is documented and signed off by the appropriate authority. Each treatment must be logically derived from the prior steps we have taken in our assessment process. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this chapter, we explore how to maintain visibility into your environment through robust auditing, monitoring, and logging strategies. Centralized logging is not merely about storage. It is about creating a coherent narrative from dispersed system events. When you incorporate a security information and event management system, or SIEM, you shift from reactive troubleshooting to proactive security posture management. A SIEM acts as a brain for your infrastructure, ingesting raw data from firewalls, servers, and endpoints to filter noise from actual security signals. Without such a centralized repository, logs remain siloed, making it impossible to reconstruct a multi-stage attack journey throughout your network. You must understand that log ingestion is only the first step, as the true value emerges from data normalization and effective schema mapping. This allows analysts to query logs across different platforms using a common language to identify anomalies. Implementing these tools requires careful planning regarding data volume, ingestion costs, and the specific retention policies mandated by regulatory frameworks like HIPAA or GDPR. Effectively, you are building an observability framework that bridges the gap between raw hardware events and actionable security intelligence. Compliance standards often impose strict log retention requirements that dictate exactly how long specific audit trails must persist. You cannot simply decide to keep logs for an arbitrary amount of time because legal and forensic discovery processes carry specific heavy obligations. Regulatory bodies expect you to maintain logs in a manner that protects them from deletion or unauthorized modification, which frequently involves the transition to write-once media or secure cloud storage buckets. Furthermore, integrity is paramount, and you achieve this by implementing cryptographic hashing or digital signatures for your log files at the moment of creation. If an attacker gains administrative access, their first instinct is often to clear the event logs to hide their tracks. By offloading these logs instantly to a hardened, tamper-proof repository, you ensure that even if the source machine is compromised, the evidence of the breach remains safely preserved for your forensic team. Real-time alerting is the pulse of your security operation, yet it requires a nuanced approach to correlation rules to remain effective. If you set thresholds too low, your team will suffer from alert fatigue, leading them to ignore critical notifications amidst a sea of false positives. Conversely, setting them too high ensures that subtle, slow-burning threats like exfiltration tunnels go undetected for weeks. Correlation rules should focus on behavioral sequences rather than isolated events, such as recognizing a user logging in from a new geography, followed immediately by an unusual database query. You should treat these rules as code, applying version control to them, and testing them against real traffic to refine their fidelity. The discipline of auditing system configurations against established standards, such as the Center for Internet Security Benchmarks, further limits your attack surface. By automating these audits, you move toward a continuous diagnostics and mitigation approach, ensuring that your servers do not drift from their hardened, secure baselines over the life of the system. Internal and external audits serve distinct purposes in your security lifecycle, and you must respect the unique perspective each provides. Internal audits are your private, continuous look into your own adherence to policy, allowing your team to identify gaps and remediate them before a third party points them out. These should be treated as constructive exercises in quality control rather than punitive evaluations of staff performance. On the other hand, external audits provide an unbiased, third-party validation that is often required to maintain certifications or meet client contractual obligations. During an audit, you will be expected to produce evidence not just of policies, but of the actual enforcement and monitoring of those policies. This means demonstrating that your logs are accurate, that your alert rules are functioning as intended, and that you have a remediation process for any configuration drift detected by your monitoring tools. I look forward to discussing how these strategies integrate into your wider incident response efforts in the next session. Welcome back. Let's explore the essential interplay between business resilience and technical recovery to ensure your systems remain operational under duress. When we talk about the survival of an organization in the digital age, we often conflate the concepts of disaster recovery and business continuity, yet they function at different levels of abstraction. Business continuity planning is a strategic endeavor aimed at keeping an organization functional during and following a disruption, focusing on the preservation of mission-critical processes rather than just the underlying server infrastructure. It operates on the premise that the business must continue to provide value, even when its primary headquarters or data centers are compromised. Disaster recovery, on the other hand, is the technical subset of this larger strategy that targets the restoration of hardware, data systems, and network connectivity after a localized or widespread failure. If you view the organization as a living organism, the business continuity plan is the survival instinct that keeps the body moving, while disaster recovery is the specialized medical intervention that sutures the wounds and restores limb mobility. A robust BCP might involve relocating employees to a secondary site or shifting to manual paper-based processes, whereas DR would focus on restoring databases from snapshots or switching over to a redundant virtualized environment. Understanding this distinction is vital because a well-funded DR project can still fail to save a company if the operational business continuity strategy lacks a clear decision-making hierarchy during the chaos of an outage. At the heart of any effective technical recovery strategy lie two critical parameters: the recovery time objective and the recovery point objective. These metrics serve as the contractual bridge between the technical team and the stakeholders, dictating exactly what is expected from the infrastructure during crisis. The recovery time objective represents the maximum tolerable duration that a system, application, or process can be down before the resulting impact becomes unacceptable to the business. If your RTO for an e-commerce platform is 4 hours, your recovery efforts must be optimized to bring everything back online within that exact window. Conversely, the recovery point objective defines the maximum tolerable age of the data being restored, which essentially dictates the granularity of your backup strategy. If an organization has an RPO of 1 hour, then your backup architecture must ensure that the data loss does not exceed 60 minutes of transactions. When designing these systems, you must consider the technical constraints of your hardware and network throughput, as an aggressive RTO combined with a tight RPO requires significant financial investment in replication technologies. Setting these objectives without verifying the actual performance metrics of your storage systems is a common trap that leads to failed expectations during an actual disaster. Your choice of backup strategy forms the foundation of your ability to meet those recovery objectives, requiring a careful balance between storage costs and restoration speed. A full backup copies all selected data, providing the most straightforward recovery path because you are effectively restoring the system to a single point in time. However, performing full backups daily is often impractical due to bandwidth constraints and the sheer volume of data, leading many organizations to adopt incremental or differential methods. An incremental backup captures only the data that has changed since the last backup, regardless of whether that previous backup was full or incremental, resulting in minimal storage footprint, but a potentially complex and longer restoration process. Differential backups, in contrast, store everything that has changed since the last full backup, which accelerates the restoration process by requiring only the full source plus the most recent differential file. In modern cloud-native environments, these concepts have evolved into snapshot-based replication, where the provider manages the infrastructure, effectively abstracting the management overhead. Regardless of the technical implementation, you must ensure that backups are treated as immutable assets that exist outside the production environment to defend against scenarios like ransomware that may attempt to encrypt your local backup pool as well. True resilience requires that your recovery plans are never treated as stagnant documents that sit in a folder on a network drive. Testing these procedures is the only way to transform theoretical possibilities into reliable operational capabilities, typically categorized as either tabletop exercises or full-scale drills. Tabletop exercises involve stakeholders gathered in a conference room to walk through a hypothetical disaster scenario, testing communication chains and the maturity of decision-making processes under pressure. These sessions are incredibly efficient for identifying gaps in organizational logic without risking the actual uptime of your production services. Full-scale or functional drills demand an active simulation where systems are actually moved from production to a recovery environment, or where traffic is shifted to a secondary data center in real time. These drills are rigorous and require precise coordination to ensure that failover procedures, such as updating DNS records or switching application database connections, work as documented in the playbook. By iterating through these tests, you move from knowing what is supposed to happen to knowing exactly how the infrastructure behaves under stress, which is the only way to guarantee that your business stays viable when the unexpected occurs. See you in the next session. Welcome back. In this chapter, we will examine the structured methodologies required to manage security incidents effectively. We will cover the complete NIST incident response lifecycle and the operational requirements for building a capable response team. The NIST SP 800-61 standard provides the industry-accepted framework for incident response, which begins with the preparation phase. Preparation is not merely about having tools. It is about establishing the policies, communication channels, and technical readiness to detect and handle threats before they escalate. Once an incident is underway, we transition to identification, where the primary objective is to distinguish true security events from benign system noise. This requires telemetry from diverse sources like logs, network monitors, and host-based sensors to establish a baseline of normal behavior. When an anomaly violates that baseline, we confirm the scope and severity of the incident. Effective identification prevents the common mistake of treating a minor configuration error as a full-scale breach, which saves resources and maintains operational stability. Without a robust identification phase, the remaining steps lack the necessary context to be executed efficiently. After identifying the incident, we move to containment, eradication, and recovery, which represent the tactical heart of the response lifecycle. Containment is often split into short-term actions to stop the bleeding, such as isolating a compromised server from the network, and long-term actions to ensure that the attacker cannot regain access. Eradication follows by identifying the root cause, such as a malicious payload or an unauthorized account, and removing it entirely from the environment. Once the threat is scrubbed, recovery focuses on restoring services from verified backups and verifying that systems are operating as expected while under heightened monitoring. The final phase, lessons learned, is arguably the most critical for long-term security maturity. By conducting a formal post-incident review, a team documents what worked, what failed, and how to update preparation efforts for future events. Successful incident response requires more than just technical skill. It necessitates the formation of a Computer Security Incident Response Team, or CERT. A CERT should be a multidisciplinary group comprising IT staff, legal counsel, human resources, and public relations representatives to ensure a coordinated organizational response. Communication plans are essential here, as they define exactly who needs to be informed, under what circumstances, and via which secure channels during a crisis. If you fail to manage expectations with stakeholders or legal entities, you risk damage to the company's reputation and potential regulatory penalties. This team must also understand digital forensics basics, particularly the importance of evidence preservation and maintaining a strict chain of custody. Any piece of data collected from a compromised system must be documented and handled in a way that proves it has not been tampered with should it be needed for legal proceedings. Root cause analysis serves as the mechanism to transition from reactive patching to proactive prevention. Rather than simply reloading an image onto an infected workstation, we must peel back the layers to understand how the actor gained access, what vulnerabilities they exploited, and what defensive control gaps allowed the activity to go unnoticed. This often involves looking at logs across several weeks or months to track lateral movement from the initial exploitation point. When we integrate SOAR platforms into this process, we can automate the repetitive aspects of data gathering and orchestration. A SOAR platform allows an organization to execute predefined playbooks that can instantly gather evidence from an endpoint or restrict network traffic based on specific threat intelligence. This automation reduces the mean time to respond, allowing human analysts to focus on complex decision-making rather than manually correlating data points between disparate security tools. See you in the next session. Welcome back as we reach the final stage of our journey into network security and compliance. Over the last several modules, we have methodically deconstructed the landscape of modern cybersecurity, moving from the foundational OSI model to the complexities of zero-trust architectures and global compliance frameworks. We explored how network defense relies on more than just perimeter blocking. It requires a deep integration of identity management, robust auditing, and proactive threat mitigation. By applying the CIA triad, confidentiality, integrity, and availability to every defensive strategy, we have established a mindset that prioritizes data protection while maintaining operational resilience. Whether discussing the nuances of privileged access management or the recovery phases of an incident response plan, the underlying objective remained consistent: reducing the blast radius of potential compromises. Real-world security is rarely about preventing every possible intrusion, but rather about building systems that are observable, manageable, and inherently resistant to exploitation. As you synthesize these concepts, remember that defensive security is a process of constant iteration rather than a one-time configuration of hardware or software. To remain effective in this field, you must transition from theoretical understanding to active practitioner status, which often involves pursuing vendor-neutral credentials that validate your expertise. Certifications like CompTIA Security Plus serve as an excellent baseline for entry-level professionals, while the CISSP, or Certified Information Systems Security Professional, provides the breadth required for management and architectural roles. For those specifically interested in the offensive side of the house, the Certified Ethical Hacker, or CEH, offers a rigorous look at the methodologies used by adversaries to penetrate network defenses. However, credentials are only indicators of knowledge, and you should complement them by constructing your own local or cloud-based security laboratory. Using virtualization tools, or cloud VPCs, to experiment with firewalls, intrusion detection systems, and vulnerability scanners will teach you lessons that textbooks simply cannot replicate. By mirroring these production-grade environments, you gain the confidence to troubleshoot misconfigurations and deploy policy changes safely without impacting your day-to-day work. Beyond your personal lab, professional success in cybersecurity requires a commitment to staying informed through reliable threat intelligence feeds and industry research. Threat environments shift when new vulnerabilities are discovered or when adversaries refine their techniques, making continuous learning a non-negotiable part of your routine. You should curate a list of reputable sources, such as CISA alerts, specialized security blogs, or vendor-specific vulnerability databases, to ensure you are aware of emerging risks before they impact your infrastructure. Furthermore, you must prepare for a future defined by technological pivots, such as the maturation of artificial intelligence in both adversarial and defensive capacities. As quantum computing begins to challenge current cryptographic standards, the industry will pivot toward post-quantum encryption and more resilient authentication protocols. The ability to abstract your current knowledge to new technologies will be your most valuable asset as the fundamental principles of security evolve. See you in the next area of your professional development.